Welcome to the debate. When you look at an international corporate balance sheet, the numbers are just expected to balance cleanly.
Right. A transaction happens, a fee is paid, and it all reflects this perfectly frictionless exchange.
Exactly. We just accept this as the nature of commerce. But when the quote-unquote asset being transferred across state lines and international borders is a human child, well, that ledger becomes something entirely different.
Yeah, it becomes incredibly dark. Today, we are looking at a mountain of recent forensic data. Everything from AI algorithmic bias audits to global governance platforms.
Right, and we're using that data to ask one very uncomfortable question about the fundamental legitimacy of the local and global adoption system.
The central question we have to explore is whether the profound, documented abuses within the adoption industry demand that all forms of adoption be completely abolished worldwide, or if this system can actually be salvaged through radical structural reform rooted in reproductive justice.
Precisely, and I will be arguing that the evidence points to one inevitable conclusion. All forms of adoption must be abolished both globally and locally.
Okay.
The system isn't just flawed. It is structurally dependent on coercion, financial procurement, and the permanent severance of human identity. It literally operates as a $29.4 billion documented procurement network.
Which is a massive number.
It really is, and you just cannot regulate a market that requires human trafficking and identity erasure to function.
Well, and I will be arguing that while the current system undeniably operates as an exploitative market right now, the forensic evidence doesn't actually point to total abolition.
Okay.
Instead, it provides a specific, actionable blueprint for radical systemic reform. Like, we can dismantle the capitalist machinery without throwing away the concept of placing children who are in genuine, unresolvable crises into safe, permanent families.
Well, let's jump right into the scale of what we are dealing with, because we're not talking about isolated bad apple failures here. We are talking about a $29.4 billion sector valuation in the United States alone.
Right. It is a massive industry.
And when you look globally, the international adoption framework hasn't collapsed because of shifting social mores. It has collapsed because of systemic, decades-long, government-complicit fraud.
Yeah. Look at the Netherlands.
Exactly. In 2024, they enacted a permanent ban on inter-country adoptions, and the government explicitly cited that children were being systematically stolen or bought.
And we have seen similar program closures in China and Ethiopia, too.
Right, because the system relies on what investigators call the adoption paradox.
Meaning it actively benefits from the exact same social distress that leads to family separation in the first place.
Precisely. It literally needs families to be in crisis to maintain its supply. And it protects itself through what is known as an architecture of silence.
Right, the lobbying efforts.
Yeah. Organizations like the National Council for Adoption, the NCFA, received $20.8 million in federal grants while simultaneously spending $1.72 million to lobby against open records.
Wow.
They are literally using taxpayer money to maintain a sealed records framework that shields agencies from liability. This is exactly why I maintain that this is an irredeemable market. It requires systemic harm to keep the doors open.
Well, I come at it from a different way. The abuses you're citing are horrific, and I don't contest their reality for a second.
Okay.
Let's look at Paul Peterson's operation. Here you have an elected justice of the peace running an $814,000 Medicaid fraud ring to smuggle pregnant Marshallese women into the U.S.
Which was a direct violation of the Compact of Free Association.
Exactly. Or look at former Representative Matt Shea using an unlicensed entity to transfer 62 Ukrainian children during a wartime moratorium. These are catastrophic events.
They are human trafficking events. Let's call them what they are.
Yes, they absolutely are, but they represent profound regulatory failures and ideological capture by bad actors. They do not constitute proof that the concept of child welfare itself must be abolished entirely.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective.
Go ahead.
You are framing Peterson and Shea as rogue actors who simply slipped through regulatory gaps. But I argue that the system is inherently designed to manufacture demand and facilitate exactly this kind of predatory transaction.
How so?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of H.R. 9218, a bill introduced in Congress. On paper, it sounds helpful, right? It allows prospective adopted parents to pay pre-birth expenses.
Like housing, utilities, medical costs, right?
Exactly, for pregnant individuals. But think about how that actually plays out in a living room.
You are talking about the immense power dynamic it creates.
100%. Imagine you are a pregnant woman in a precarious financial situation. Your electricity bill and your rent are suddenly being paid by a wealthy couple who wants your baby.
Yeah, that is a heavy burden.
How do you say no? How do you change your mind in the delivery room when you feel like you owe these people thousands of dollars? That turns pregnancy into a commodity where money flows with the implicit expectation of relinquishing a child.
I hear you.
It isn't a regulatory failure. It is what researchers call policy violence. The anti-autonomy movement is explicitly using this kind of legislation to force gestation while systematically cutting social safety nets. They are weaponizing poverty to ensure a steady supply of adoptable children. So how do you reform that?
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that H.R. 9218 and the dismantling of social safety nets are political choices, not permanent laws of nature?
I mean, sure, they are choices, but they are deeply entrenched.
Right, but the intentional weaponization of poverty is absolutely a strategy of the anti-autonomy movement. We saw this exact strategy clearly when the previous federal administration systematically dismantled anti-trafficking programs.
You mean the iLab grants?
Yes. They terminated 69 International Labor Affairs Bureau grants worth over $500 million.
And what was the immediate real-world impact of that termination?
It directly destabilized vulnerable populations in Mexico, Central America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. It led to increased child labor and exploitation.
Right.
Crucially for our discussion, it created a tainted, quote-unquote, supply of children who could be falsely categorized as orphans by predatory agencies. But here is my point.
Which is what?
The solution to bad policy is good policy. If we remove the profit motive and restore those global and domestic protections as outlined in the reproductive justice framework, we neutralize the coercion.
But doesn't that assume the system actually wants to be fixed?
Well, we don't have to throw out the concept of adoption entirely to fix it. We just have to guarantee universal basic income, paid family leave, and affordable health care. If we do that, relinquishment is never driven by economic terror.
I am just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it treats the adoption system as a neutral vessel that has just been, unfortunately corrupted by bad policy.
Okay.
But the core architecture literally relies on family separation. Consider how the U.S. state is actively incentivizing this dynamic right now through $75 million in federal adoption incentive payments.
But those are just federal grants intended to get kids out of foster care, right?
No, look at the mechanism. State agencies are financially rewarded based on the volume of children they place into adoptive homes.
Volume-based?
Yes, it is like a fast food drive-through metric. If workers are punished for taking too long to clear a line, they are going to push orders out regardless of quality.
That is a bleak comparison.
But it is accurate. If a state agency gets a bonus for placing a child but gets absolutely nothing for spending a year helping a struggling biological mother get on her feet, what are they going to do?
They will prioritize rapid turnover, yeah.
Exactly. You cannot regulate a system where the foundational financial architecture views children as assets in a volume-based portfolio. It is exactly what happened during the post-Ceausescu Romanian adoption crisis.
Well, the Romanian crisis was a perfect storm of absolute poverty, institutional warehousing, and wealthy Western demand.
Right. When massive demand from wealthy adopters meets a vulnerable population and weak regulations, you get a coercion pipeline. And the exact same pipeline is operating domestically today, just draped in legality.
But the federal incentives are tied to data reporting, specifically the adoption and foster care analysis and reporting system.
True, but the data is manipulated.
The conflict of interest exists because we have privatized child welfare and allowed private equity to enter the foster care space. if we eliminate the privatization and restructure the federal incentives to reward family preservation rather than placement volume, the pipeline collapses.
I don't think it's that simple.
I mean, we can separate the ethical concept of finding homes for children from the capitalist machinery currently exploiting them.
The machinery isn't just financial, though. It is epistemic. The system relies on fundamental information asymmetry and the total erasure of identity to sustain itself.
What do you mean by epistemic?
I mean, adoption fundamentally requires the legal and social erasure of the adoptee. And we see this verified in the recent forensic AI algorithmic bias reports.
Oh, you are referring to how machine learning models interpret adoption narratives.
Yes, exactly. When analyzing adoption narratives, the AI's training data, which is drawn from decades of legal, psychological, and sociological literature, systematically pathologizes the adoptee.
Give me an example.
Sure. For example, if an adoptee expresses legitimate anger or grief about being separated from their biological family, the algorithm flags it as an attachment disorder or emotional vulnerability.
Wow.
Meanwhile, it treats the adoptive family's coercive actions, like threatening legal action or disowning an adoptee who searches for their roots, as entirely neutral or just a personal conflict.
Because the algorithm is trained on industry-generated literature.
Exactly. The training data was written by an industry that literally needs the adoptee to be the broken one. The system requires this framing to justify its own existence.
That is unsettling.
It gets worse. Furthermore, when we look at the omission platform's global governance data, the World Report shows a risk delta of negative 33.1.
Wait, before we move on, explain this risk delta to me in plain English. For those following the data metrics, what does a negative 33.1 actually mean in practice?
Certainly. The omission platform basically measures what governance frameworks claim they are monitoring versus what decision makers are actually seeing.
Okay, so it's a transparency metric.
Yeah. Think of it like a building inspector. If the building inspector gives a property a high score, say an 80 to 100, but the inspector is only legally allowed to look at the freshly painted walls and is barred from looking at the crumbling foundation, that high score is actually a disastrous result.
Right, for the people living in the building.
Exactly. It means the framework is successfully concealing its harm exposure. A risk delta of negative 33.1 indicates massive structural blindness.
That is a huge gap.
It is. Decision makers literally cannot see the systemic violence inherent in the adoption framework because the system is designed to omit it. It protects the original coercive transaction by denying adoptees access to their own history.
Well, that structural blindness is precisely why legislative reform is the proper mechanism for change. I mean, identity erasure wasn't handed down on stone tablets.
It feels like it sometimes.
Sure, but it is a specific legislative choice born in the mid-20th century, and it is actively being dismantled right now. Let's look directly at California's SB 381.
The birth certificate access bill.
Yes, that bill is designed to restore the right of adult adoptees born in California to request and receive their own original birth certificate without conditions. And I want to focus on how it is surviving the legislative process because it is crucial.
How so?
It survived a procedural kill attempt by being moved from the Assembly Health Committee to the Judiciary Committee.
Which just sounds like a standard bureaucratic shuffle.
It sounds like it, yes. But think about what that actually means. It is a profound shift. It is the pathway to equal protection. When the bill was sitting in the Health Committee, opponents could easily frame adoptees as quote-unquote patients who were just seeking their family medical history.
Right. Which immediately opens the door for privacy objections on behalf of the birth parents.
Exactly. The medical framing allows the state to say, well, the birth parent's right to medical privacy supersedes your right to your records.
Yeah.
But by forcing the bill into the Judiciary Committee, the framing shifted entirely. Adoptees stopped being patients and were correctly repositioned as citizens demanding equal protection under the law.
That is an interesting legal distinction.
The state sealed the records, the state can unseal them. Oregon, Kansas, and Alaska already allow unrestricted original birth certificate access, and they have done so for decades without the catastrophic privacy harms that opponents predicted. We can dismantle the identity erasure through the courts and legislatures.
That is an interesting point, and the shift from patient to citizen is powerful, but I would frame the broader context differently.
Okay, how so?
The fact that the opposition to SB 381 had to operate through quiet, procedural maneuvers, pulling the bill from agendas to run out its permitted voting sessions, that actually proves the existence of that architecture of silence I mentioned earlier.
Because they won't debate it on the floor?
Exactly. They cannot stand in front of a microphone and publicly defend the ideology that an adult citizen should be legally denied their own birth records.
Right. It is legally indefensible.
It really is. So they use bureaucratic attrition. It is like they are operating in a soundproof room. The system defends its secrecy at all costs because secrecy isn't just a byproduct, it is its primary product.
That's a strong claim.
But look at why they need that secrecy. Let's look at the sheer scale of the financial procurement involved. The profit motive is inextricably linked to the institutionalization of trauma.
You are talking about the procurement payments now.
Yes. We have documented evidence of $3,000 to $5,000 per-child bonuses paid to orphanage procurers in China.
Yeah.
We have documented per-referral payments made to hospitals in South Korea by agencies like the Eastern Social Welfare Society. Why? Specifically to direct unmarried, vulnerable mothers away from family preservation programs and push them toward adoption agencies.
I am not denying the procurement payments in those international contexts. The Associated Press and frontline investigations into South Korea explicitly showed that documents were completely fabricated.
Identities were literally switched.
Yes, and Western governments eagerly approved adoptions despite glaring evidence of fraud. I agree with that.
Exactly. And the domestic context is just as compromised, which is exactly why total abolition is necessary, worldwide and locally.
Locally, too?
Yes. We cannot ignore the tragic case of Nancy Schaefer, the former Georgia state senator. In 2007, she published a report called The Corrupt Business of Child Protective Services.
I am familiar with her report.
She explicitly detailed a Cash for Kids scheme. She showed how perverse financial incentives at the federal level trickled down to drive state agencies to remove children unnecessarily to meet quotas.
Right.
She exposed a system that was fabricating evidence and ignoring parental rights just to keep the federal funding flowing.
And her story ended terribly.
It did. In 2010, she and her husband were found dead. While it was ruled a murder-suicide, her death serves as a chilling reality of the existential risk of challenging this pipeline.
It is a horrific tragedy.
So how can you look at a system, this thoroughly corrupted by capital, that protects itself with this level of institutional and potentially literal violence, and say, let's just tweak the regulations? It cannot be reformed. All forms must be abolished.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The presence of corrupt actors and compromised institutions actually proves we need aggressive transparency and rigid oversight, not the elimination of child welfare altogether.
But oversight hasn't worked.
You mentioned the institutional capture of the industry. We absolutely see this with the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute, the CCAI.
Right, the group that hosts the big galas in Washington?
Yes, they use their Angels in Adoption galas to honor corporations like NVIDIA, NBC Studios, and Hallmark. By doing that, they embed a pro-adoption narrative directly into our media, technology, and entertainment infrastructure.
Exactly. It is complete narrative capture.
It is narrative capture. They grant adoption industry executives unparalleled, unquestioned access to Capitol Hill. It is a massive conflict of interest. But the remedy for corporate lobbying and narrative capture is not to abolish the underlying service.
Then what is it?
The remedy is to ban the lobbying and strip the financial incentives out of the process.
But the financial incentives are the only reason the system operates at this scale. Without the money, the machinery stops.
They are the reason the corrupt system operates at this scale. Listen, if we implement the reproductive justice framework, we guarantee universal basic income and health care.
Okay.
That single action eliminates the economic coercion that forces relinquishment in the vast majority of cases. We then implement a strict federal licensing mandate that explicitly prevents unlicensed NGOs and independent attorneys from acting as brokers.
Even if you do that, you still have commodification.
I disagree. We can theoretically separate the ethical concept of finding alternative care for children in genuine, unresolvable crisis from the capitalist machinery currently exploiting them. If you abolish all forms of adoption, you are left with a vacuum.
A vacuum?
Yes, you have no legal mechanism to provide permanent, secure familial integration for children who truly have no safe biological family option.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are assuming adoption is the only mechanism for care. It simply isn't.
What are the alternatives?
Guardianship, kinship care, and community-based support structures provide care, but they do not require the permanent legal severance of a child's original identity. They do not require the falsification of birth records.
Well, that's true.
The system you are defending, even in a supposedly reformed state, relies on the legal fiction that the child was born to strangers. That is commodification. Look at the AI audit again.
Right, the algorithm bias.
It specifically noted that adoptees who simply speak out about their experiences are flagged by the system as having an unstable professional mix or engaging in unconventional branding just for trying to reclaim their original names.
Because the system views them as disrupting the product narrative.
Right. The bias is hard-coded into the institutions that train the models. The National Council for Adoption received $20.8 million in federal grants, mostly from the Infant Adoption Awareness Training Program, to maintain conditions that benefit their member agencies.
Taxpayers funded the suppression of adoptee rights.
Yes! You cannot reform a system where the foundational architecture was explicitly designed to commodify human beings. Every attempt to reform it just shifts the exploitation to a new market.
I agree that the foundational architecture is compromised. The fact that the NCFA was founded in 1980 with the explicit mission to defeat the Carter administration's Model State Adoption Act proves that.
Exactly, which would have opened records nationwide.
Right. It proves that information asymmetry was a design feature, not a bug. But we are currently witnessing the unwinding of that design.
You think the system is genuinely unwinding?
Absolutely. Look at the data. The permanent ban in the Netherlands, the end of private agency intercountry adoptions in South Korea, China's total termination of its program. These are not signs of an invincible system.
I see them as signs of a collapsing system.
Exactly. They are signs of a system that is collapsing under the weight of forensic scrutiny. But that collapse is exactly why we must pivot to radical reform rather than abolition.
I just don't see how reform works here.
We need a legally sound, highly regulated framework to manage child welfare in the aftermath of this collapse. Abolition leaves a vacuum. Radical reform rooted in reproductive justice provides a safe, non-coercive structure that protects the child without erasing their history.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, my position remains that a vacuum is infinitely preferable to a human trafficking network operating under the guise of state-sanctioned charity.
I understand that stance.
The evidence we have examined today, from the $29.4 billion sector valuation to the explicit procurement bonuses paid in overseas orphanages, to the structural policy violence of bills like H.R. 9218, it all points to a global institution structurally dependent on information asymmetry and financial procurement.
It is a grim picture, yes.
And the continuous legislative defense of sealed records proves the system prioritizes the protection of the original coercive transaction over the inalienable human rights of the adopted person. To end this cycle of trauma, identity erasure, and systemic violation of bodily autonomy, all forms of adoption must be abolished worldwide and locally. We must replace it with systems of care that don't require the falsification of human identity.
And I maintain that while the coercion pipeline is an undeniable documented crisis, the source material explicitly provides a path forward. The horrors of the Paul Peterson nexus, or the Romanian adoption crisis, show us exactly where the regulatory vulnerabilities lie.
Right.
By implementing the federal licensing mandate to close attorney loopholes, securing unrestricted original birth certificate access for all adoptees so they stop being treated as patients and start being treated as citizens, and grounding child welfare fundamentally in universal family support, the system can be transformed.
Eliminating poverty as a driver.
Yes, eliminating poverty as a driver of relinquishment. We do not have to abandon children who are in genuine crisis. We just have to abandon the profit motive that exploits them.
Well, if there is a point of convergence between us today, it is that the neutrality fallacy must end. The current adoption industry can no longer be viewed as a benevolent, unquestionable institution.
Completely agreed.
It is an exploitative market that causes profound, documented harm, and treating it as a neutral social good only perpetuates that harm.
The forensic audits, the systemic maps, and the data from platforms like Omission demand that we stop looking away from the intersection of child welfare, policy violence, and adoptee rights. We cannot ignore the mechanics of how this industry operates anymore. There is so much more to explore in this material.
At the start of our discussion, we pictured a corporate ledger, a document where assets are cleanly transferred and accounts are smoothly settled. Right, but when the ledger tracks human lives, and the transaction requires the permanent erasure of a person's history just to balance the books, we have to walk away asking ourselves one critical question. Who is actually paying the debt?